Hi, I'm Helen Bauer, and this is the Heart of Hospice podcast. The Heart of Hospice podcast is your source for compassionate and informative discussions about hospice and end-of-life care. I'm a certified hospice and palliative care nurse with over 15 years of experience. Whether you're a caregiver, someone with a serious illness, or you simply need to know more about hospice care, this podcast is for you. Join me as we explore all the aspects of hospice, from the details of caregiving to the emotional and spiritual dimensions of end-of-life journeys. For more resources and to connect with me, visit theheartofhospice.com and find us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Keep listening for today's episode.
This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time. Content presented in the following podcast is for information purposes only. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host and guest and may not represent the views and opinions of the Whole Care Network. Always consult with your physician for any medical advice, and always consult with your attorney for any legal advice. And thank you for listening to the Whole Care Network.
This episode is being sponsored by bkbooks.com. BK Books helps care teams and families understand what to expect at the end of life. Created by Barbara Carnes, these trusted booklets and videos explain the physical and emotional changes of dying with warmth and clarity. Whether you're guiding others or caring for someone you love, BK Books brings understanding that eases fear and fosters peace. Explore our compassionate resources at bkbooks.com. This episode is being sponsored by Lasting Remembrance. Lasting Remembrance knows that sometimes words aren't enough. If you're struggling to find the right thing to say to someone who's grieving, a memorial blanket offers comfort and meaning. A memorial blanket will become a permanent keepsake to be treasured for years to come. Visit lastingremembrance.com today to create a keepsake that honors a memory. Use the code Heart of Hospice to receive a 10% discount.
Hospice social worker Rosie Gaston is my guest today for a deep conversation on the anxiety we have around death, where it comes from, and how end-of-life workers can help make it easier. My guest, my friend, Rosie Gaston, is a passionate and energetic clinical social worker. She has over a decade of experience supporting individuals, families, and professionals through the intricate journey of end-of-life care. She got started as a hospice volunteer, and she contributes to the field of hospice through research and speaking at local and national levels. In 2022, she founded A Better Ending. It's a business designed to focus on community education, and it fosters professional development in the end-of-life space. She also continues to serve part-time as a hospice social worker. Rosie is an adjunct professor at the University of Minnesota, and she's also a board member for the Minnesota Network of Hospice and Palliative Care. You can find all the resources that the network has to offer at mnhpc.com. And in case that's hard to understand on an audio recording, just check out the show notes. There'll be a link there for you. The only experience that people fear more than death is public speaking. Even though the fear of death might be second in line, death anxiety is really real, very real. It's a universal experience that affects everyone because we're all going to die, right? Well, Rosie and I talked about the way it influences our day-to-day lives even. She calls out the people who say there's nothing to fear about death. And then we had an interesting discussion about the influence of religion on a patient's fear of death. And she shares some studies and articles on this particular topic. We also talked about how death anxiety is often higher in marginalized communities, and for very good reason due to the history of healthcare in the United States. We also acknowledged that it's extremely important for a hospice team to open the door for conversations about death and dying and all the anxiety that a patient or a family member might have surrounding death. If you want to connect with Rosie and the work that she's doing, you can find her at abetterending.org. And remember, check the show notes for a link to the website. This was a great conversation. We got really, really down deep in the weeds on this one about death anxiety. So be sure to listen to the end because we're talking about mitigating that anxiety. I hope you'll stick with it all the way to the finish of the conversation. There's a lot to learn. Rosie, welcome back to the podcast. I'm going to have to start paying you more. You're almost like a co-host now.
Oh, trust me, the pleasure's all mine.
Well, it's so good to have you back on the show. We've had numerous conversations, and today's topic is one that is sort of near and dear because I think it's integrated through everything any end-of-life worker does. Because we are talking about the anxiety that people have surrounding dying and death. Death anxiety, yeah. So here's how we want to start this out. Today, we want our listener to stand up and give a speech. You're in speech class back in high school. You have to write a speech, and you have to memorize it, heaven forbid, and you have to speak it. You have to do this talk in front of, say, 30 judgmental high school teenagers.
Oh, my nightmare.
I'm telling you, I feel like my face
You're
is
bringing me
breaking out or
back right
something.
now.
Yeah,
You're bringing me back.
a little bit of teenage PTSD with that.
Yep.
Well, the reason I bring that up is because that is a very anxiety-provoking event.
Absolutely. I'll tell you, I felt it in high school when I would do speaking, whether it be speech club or in drama, you always felt it. And I will say even 20 years later now, when I step on a stage to speak anywhere, anytime, any audience, I still get so stinking nervous. It is still such a response that I have. Yeah.
Yeah, me too. I don't like to think of it as giving a speech. I like to think of it as teaching.
Sure.
Yeah, that doesn't help, actually. I still get pretty anxious, especially if I am speaking to my peers, because these are people who know if I make a mistake.
Sure.
Yeah, and I'm worried that I'm gesturing too much or I'm going to trip.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And especially when I think the topic really matters to you as a teacher, presenter, whatever title you want to give to it, when the content really matters to you and it's important to you that it lands well. In my role, so often it's not just teaching about a concept or a theory, it's also how do we apply it? And so there's always that bit of that jittery nerves outside of just, oh my God, am I going to forget what am I going to say? Am I totally going to have a brain fart up there? There's also the piece of like, am I going to be able to communicate this in a way that lands?
Yeah.
Right. So,
Yeah. And you go back and forth between the am I going to do a good job to is the button on my blouse open?
yeah.
Are my pants unzipped? That kind of thing. So the reason we're leading in with all of this is because more people are afraid of public speaking. Not public speakers, but of being a public speaker, having to speak in public, than they are afraid of dying. But almost every patient that I have come in contact with has had death anxiety in some form or another.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's definitely a big unknown.
Mm-hmm. And it's a universal experience too. This is something I think that is every single human being that is walking amongst us, our family, our neighbors, those that we serve, even those of us that are healthcare professionals, those that we work alongside. Death anxiety is such a universal and human experience. Every single one of us is going to die.
Right.
Right. And it's so final. It's so final that and it's so unknown for so many as well too, that this anxious experience can really come into play from lack of exposure. Um, and even when we've had exposure, I think death anxiety can come when that exposure was a really, really challenging and tough situation.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true. So we have the great unknown
Yeah.
that comes with actually dying,
Yeah.
but being exposed to death, that exposure's changed in Western culture. It's very
Yeah.
different than it used to be because we have medicalized. People die in the hospital and then they come out, and the next time you see them, they're in the casket.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily get to see that process or how it's managed, how a person is made comfortable, what that particular transition from breathing and living to death is like. And I don't know about you, but I do not like things that are unexpected or I don't know anything about. I like to be prepared.
And and we're thinking of our Western culture here and really looking at, back, we'll say about the last 100 years. You're talking about this medicalization of the dying process, right?
Yes.
And it isn't just the dying process, and when we think back 100 years ago, when folks got sick, there was also only so far that medicine could take someone. So oftentimes, maybe they'd call the doctor in to do a home visit. Oftentimes, it was a religious leader to come in and maybe do some prayers. And then it was the family members that took care in the community, not just family, but the community that took care of people in the homes.
Right.
So then, you have kiddos that are running alongside a dying body in a house because it's just normal. It's what happens, right? And then as medical advances, now have, vaccines, we now have antibiotics, we now have all of this treatment. And so we started to see this drastic shift of now when people got sick, they didn't call the doctor to do a home visit. They didn't call the pastor, the priest to come out and do the blessing while the body stayed at home. People went into the hospital and tried and tried and tried to do what they could to extend life, you
Yeah.
know? But it wasn't just that, it was also the boom of the funeral industry as well too. Again, we think back 100 years ago, and after that body died, it would stay in the home, and the community again would care for the body, and there would be rituals, and there would be people coming and going throughout the house. I mean, the funeral itself was oftentimes held in people's homes.
Right. That's why they called them funeral parlors at
Yes, yeah,
first. Yeah.
and so it wasn't just the dying process, it was also the after death process that was taken out of communities and homes and brought into this more institutionalized type setting. But really, this isn't just like death anxiety and fear of death didn't just sprout up in the last 100 years. Like when we look back, one of the oldest pieces of literature that we have is this Babylonian poem. It was called the Epic of, I think I'm saying this right, Gilgamesh. And he was this guy where one of his best friends died in battle. And so he went on this search for immortality and discovered through his travels that he is yet a mortal man. And so he came home and wrote this epic poem, and it is one of the oldest pieces of literature we have from thousands of years ago. So this isn't just a Western concept, this isn't just a new concept. This is why I bring it back, that this is really a universal human experience that all of us have. And for a mass majority of us, our fear of death, this anxious experience related to our fears of death, are really most of the time chilling out in our unconscious mind. Like we're not even consciously aware that we have this fear of death and really how it's influencing our day-to-day life.
So let's talk about how hospice and end-of-life workers approach the topic, because this is really one of the reasons that you and I wanted to talk about this.
Yeah.
So let's first acknowledge that this is our business. Death and dying, we see it every day.
Yeah.
Every day, sometimes multiple times a day. And of course, everyone that we are making a visit with is at some point in a terminal diagnosis. So the death is expected sooner than most people, right? Yeah. So we have normalized death for ourselves because of the work that we do. How many people who are out there who are end of life workers have had someone say to them, "Oh, I could never do what you do."
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, "Yeah, this is just what we do."
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that we have built up a little bit of, I don't know, we become a little bit callous and immune to it, and maybe a little bit, should I use the word insensitive? Maybe that's not the right word, but we don't recognize the anxiety. It doesn't come up on our radar the way it does for a patient.
Yeah. So there's a few things I'm thinking of right now. I mean, when I'm thinking of us, and I'm talking about both you and I, Helen, because we either are or have been in that hospice clinician space.
Right.
There are parts of this that we have to become somewhat desensitized to, or there's no way that we could do this work every single day. And I like to highlight that does not mean that we are insensitive or act insensitively, but it's almost emotional boundaries that we have to put surrounding ourselves in order for us to sustain long-term doing this work, right? And you also think, you mentioned this just briefly, that you're anxious about things that you don't know anything about. You're anxious about things that you haven't experienced before. For us as hospice clinicians, we see that, I'll say, a majority of the time, we are able to provide a meaningful death, a peaceful death, one that is free of suffering, one where families feel supported, where patients feel supported. A majority of the time, we're able to do that, right? And so we have that perspective of, death can be beautiful. Death can be meaningful. Death can be intimate. Now, this isn't me putting lipstick on a pig, saying that grief is not one of the most gut-wrenching experiences, if not the most, that we will ever experience as human beings, right? But we can see that our ending going out of this world can be something that reflects this life that we've lived, right? And so, sometimes we hold on to those pieces. But I would agree with you. I struggle with some of, folks that are on social media, and I truly believe the intention is beautiful, but I think it's swinging the pendulum too far in the other direction when there's concepts or people saying things like we shouldn't fear death, or there's nothing to fear. I mean, I call a giant pile of bullshit on that. I'm an end of life clinician, and there are aspects of death that I still fear. And our fear of death also evolves over time. So right now, these might be the things that I fear. This might be some of the anxieties that I have. But 10 years from now, that could look very different. So I think that's also another piece is our relationship with death, like our relationship with anything else, can also evolve over time, in many different forms. But I will agree with you. I do struggle with the fact that it's come to this, there's nothing to fear, everything is good. Again, a majority of the time we can provide a good death, but I'm sure, Helen, you and I have both seen some really, really tough deaths on hospice.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Death isn't always easy. It isn't always good. And I will be the first person to say this. Hospice teams don't always manage every patient well for a myriad of other reasons. And that's another podcast episode. But I think it's dismissive. I'm the expert in this. Don't worry about it. You don't need to worry about this. It's a little bit dismissive. It's really, it sounds like you're treating someone as a child. It's nothing you need to worry about. Yeah, I'm not a fan of that kind of thing. I have seen that backfire numerous times where a family member comes back and makes a complaint. I was told this is all normal. No, it isn't, because their person has never died before.
Yeah.
That is not normal for them at all. Or it's just part of the process. And I'm not a fan of telling people things like that because, again, it's dismissive of someone's questions. They say, my mom's feet are turning very blue and her hands are turning blue. Oh, don't worry about that. It's just part of the process. Again, that sounds like I'm the expert and I have the secrets. You don't worry your little pretty head over that is what that sounds like to me. And to me, it's offensive. It's dismissive. And those fears, whether there are things that will never happen, if they seem irrational to us, they are very real to the person who has them.
Well, and when we think about death anxiety, what we fear surrounding death, this is such a multidimensional construct, right? It's influenced by the culture that we grew up in, the
Mhm.
culture that we were raised in, the household that we were raised in. Can we talk about death and dying, or is this something that is only done in secrecy? Can we openly grieve someone, or is this something that you have to show that you're tough and strong and deal with on your own? Right? I mean, there's suggestions in the literature that age and gender can impact someone's level of death anxiety. I don't know. There's just so many different factors that come into play of what people fear. And I think kind of bringing it back to your question, Helen, that's where I start with people is when we're talking about, and I'm not, don't just blatantly come out and say, what are you most scared of when it comes to dying?
Right.
Like I'm not going to come out in that way with it. But when I can understand what their biggest concern is right now, what are you most worried about? Right? Because this is going to help us identify where that fear of death is coming from. Is it maybe they're scared of the dying process because they saw their loved one, where their feet went purple and got cold and they had Cheyne-Stokes breathing and they, had the death rattle and, maybe had some terminal agitation, where that was their only experiencing witnessing death. And so that is their worry. The next
Yeah.
time a death experience comes along or their own is that they will be suffering. For some, it's the events leading up to the dying process, looking at their quality of life. We both know that there are some diagnoses that I would not even wish on my ex-boyfriend, and there's a lot of things I would wish to happen to him. But, because we know that the end of life process leading up to that, the ability to lose certain functions, whether that be physical or cognitive, that's terrifying to many people.
Yeah.
Even if you have a good medical team to help manage symptoms as they come up, if I can't recognize and my loved one and be able to say their name, if I can engage with them meaningfully, if I'm going to lose the ability to, to even move my body, and then we think of existential fears. Is this the fear of what comes after we die? And I feel that's what oftentimes I see some of these end of life clinicians speaking to is they see a peaceful moment of someone reaching out or calling out to a loved one who died before they did, and they see these end of life experiences that bring them solace. And I have to say I have as well too, and they very much have brought me comfort in my own death anxiety. But for many folks, again, who haven't seen the dying process or have maybe even issues with religion or faith, or it's a complicated relationship, it can be a lot of fear of what happens to my soul, to myself after I die. For others, it's what if I die too soon? I haven't got to do all the things I wanted to do yet. So all of a sudden you get this diagnosis and you're in your 30s and you didn't get a chance to have kids or do these things. You didn't get a chance to live the life that you wanted to live. And I think one of the most common ones that I'm sure you and I have both seen is this fear of death for those in our life. So this is both the fear that someone we love is going to die, and this is also the fear of what's going to happen to the people that I love when I die.
Yes.
And it isn't just financial, like making sure the bills are paid. Like sometimes this is also caregiving roles. Other times this is, those who show up and keep the family traditions going. Like there's a lot of really, really, really real fears of what will happen to my loved ones, my family system, the communities that I impact when I die. And so that's really where I start with folks. Is when I can, when we're spending time together and I can ask the simple question of what are you most worried about right now?
Yeah.
What's concerned about?
I like that. Instead of going at it with, what are you most fearful of? But
Mm,
making it a little more, I think, relatable. What keeps you awake at night? When you wake up in the middle of the
yeah,
night, what do you think
mm,
about? Um,
yeah,
and of course, I think it's very common for people to have death anxiety about those who are closest to them or their children,
yeah,
right? I think that's a
yeah.
very real thing. This conversation is so good, but we're going to take a quick break. Hang on for more great content.
This episode is being sponsored by Lasting Remembrance. When a loved one passes away, finding the right way to honor their memory matters. Whether you yourself are grieving or you're looking for a way to comfort someone else who is, you want something meaningful. That's where Lasting Remembrance comes in. We specialize in memorial blankets, beautiful, personalized keepsakes that blend seamlessly into everyday life and keep the loved one present. Choose from a variety of designs, whether you want one customized with meaningful text or a photo of a cherished memory, or a timeless symbol such as a cardinal or a tree. Each blanket is thoughtfully created, professionally produced, and shipped directly to you. Sometimes words aren't enough. When you're struggling to find the right thing to say to someone who's grieving, a memorial blanket offers comfort and meaning, a lasting reminder of their loved one. Unlike flowers that fade, the blankets become a permanent keepsake to be treasured for years to come. Lasting Remembrance can help create a meaningful gift or give you comfort during difficult times. Visit lastingremembrance.com today to create a keepsake that honors a memory. Use the code Heart of Hospice to receive a 10% discount. Lasting Remembrance, comfort they can hold on to. When you're caring for someone who is dying, every moment matters, and it can feel overwhelming when you don't know what to expect. That's where BK Books can help. BK Books offers compassionate, easy-to-read resources for families and professionals facing the end of life. Created by nurse and hospice pioneer Barbara Carnes, these trusted guides explain the changes that happen as someone is dying and how to bring comfort, compassion, and care along the way. People don't die like they do in the movies. Understanding what's normal can ease fear and help you feel more prepared. From short booklets to helpful videos, BK Books brings clarity to the unknown, so you can focus on what matters most, being present and caring well. If you're supporting someone at the end of life, you don't have to figure it out alone. Explore the trusted resources from end-of-life educator Barbara Carnes at bkbooks.com.
So let's talk about the religious aspect of this. How does religion weigh in? So there is, I don't know, there's a belief among some hospice workers that I have heard discussed that people with no religious beliefs have a harder death. I'm here to tell you in my experience that that's not accurate in my experience. I do not think that is true. I think sometimes someone with a lot of religious faith will sort of transfer that belief on to someone else's death. I don't know that I think that's accurate, but I have heard people say that an atheist or an agnostic doesn't have as comfortable a death. How do you think faith or religion weigh in when it comes to anxiety surrounding a death?
Sure. So I want to highlight first and foremost that I'm a clinical social worker. I'm not a chaplain. But when I think about religion, faith, spirituality with death anxiety, I would absolutely agree from an anecdotal place that is what I have seen as well too. I have actually seen some atheists who are more willing to engage in the planning and move forward with their death plans. The word I want to say, it's just a more accepting of the death is going to happen.
Yes. More open-minded to the whole thing.
Yeah. What I can say from an empirical standpoint, because I've read quite a few research articles that focus on religion and death anxiety, essentially can like religion be a buffer? There was one literature review that I read, I think it's about 10 years old by now, but it looked at like 85 different studies that were looking at the relationship between religion and death anxiety. So as they were looking at these studies, they were kind of clumping them into these primary groups just to kind of see what is the relationship. So the first, what they hypothesized was that those who had strong levels of religiosity, faith, religion, would have low levels of death anxiety. So this aligns with like Ernest Becker. He wrote the famous book, The Denial of Death, and the theory, terror management theory. So essentially what that suggests is that we're all really scared of death at some point, maybe even experiencing terror. And so we lean into faith, we lean into a worldview that helps us navigate that fear. right? So this is kind of aligning with terror management theory, is that this faith in a God, this faith in an afterlife is something that brings us comfort. So the other was like a death apprehension theory. So what that suggested is actually those who have higher levels of religiosity are going to have higher levels of death anxiety because they're sitting here in this space wondering, did I live a good enough life? Will I be forgiven? Will I go to the afterlife where the people I love are? Right? And so their faith actually is something that brings them more fear and more anxiety. And then the other was more of like a curvilinearity. So essentially, what this means is those who are atheists, those who have like no levels of religiosity, and those who have very high levels are going to have the lowest levels of death anxiety. And it's those that are in the middle that have, more kind of ambiguity within their faith that actually are going to have the highest levels of death anxiety. Right. So that's what they hypothesized, is people are going to fall into those clumps. And so once they looked at all of that, all these different articles, it almost fell into kind of like a third was terror management theory, about 10% with this curvilinearity. Again, about another third was about this death apprehension. And then there was a third that had no correlation. There's no correlation between your level of religiosity and if this is a buffer or a protective factor for death anxiety. So what I'm trying to say is, what the empirical evidence suggests is, for some folks, their faith is what brings them comfort in the face of death. For others, it brings them a lot of fear. And in some, it can navigate really anywhere in between there. And this is why, again, it is so important to ask thoughtful questions about, is your faith something that brings you comfort? That's a question I ask with anyone that I'm serving. I don't just assume because you say you're Catholic or this is your faith. Is this something that's bringing you comfort right now?
Right.
And then this is also when you pull in your incredible chaplains who can speak, that's their scope of practice, to be able to help them walk through some of those existential worries, fears, and distresses. What do you think?
I have seen folks struggle with what we wouldn't call a good death, right?
Yeah.
So let's qualify that. A good death, in my definition, is whatever the patient considers to be comfortable and quality, right? For some people, that's being alone. For some people, that's music. For some people, that's a crowded room with kids running. It just depends. But I have seen people of very deep faith who did not have a comfortable, quote unquote, good death.
Yeah.
And I guess for me, coming from a nursing clinician standpoint, it's more where there's symptoms managed.
Yeah.
Because when I think about someone who's actively dying, I don't think so much about existential angst, because the patient has moved beyond expressing that, whether that's happening on some deeper level while the patient's unresponsive, I can't answer that. But to me, it's about the symptoms being managed. So physical symptoms are manifested when there's fear, when there's anxiety. You can't separate mind, body, and spirit.
Yeah.
So to me, a death that's not a quote-unquote good death is one where the symptoms are not managed, unless the patient has said, pain is purifying. Mm-hmm. Suffering is part of my personal belief system to get me ready for where I'm going from here.
The word I was thinking of as you were talking about what makes a good death for someone, the word that kept coming to my mind is their values.
Exactly. What is the patient? What are the patient's goals for their own death? Mm. Yeah. Is it to be prayed over and laid hands on? Is that what's meaningful for them? Yeah. Where do their values fall in there?
And sometimes it can be tough for us as clinicians too. I'm thinking of a case I had a few months ago, and I was serving a Hmong gentleman and his family. And I was looking through the chart. He was actively dying at this point. And I'm reading through, I'm like, why do we have tube feeds and artificial hydration going? Like, what's going on here? And, they explained to me that it was the wife's wish, in the Hmong culture, with the traditional spiritual Hmong beliefs, is that they have to prepare the body for the journey back to its native land. And so the wife's wishes were to keep the artificial nutrition and hydration going, so that way when this gentleman died, his body would have nutrients to make it, or the spirit would have nutrients to make its way back to the land that he was from, where his ancestors are. And so, I walk in the room and you can see, those of us who have been in this end of life space, this is why we are very much against artificial nutrition and hydration when the body is shutting down, because the body can't process it. And so, I walked in this room, and I mean, loving family members around this bedside, but I could see his abdomen was distended. I could hear the rattle as I opened the door. I
Oh,
mean, it's again, because the body couldn't process it.
right.
And sitting down with this wife and supporting her and educating her. And from her lens, this was a good death,
Right.
because she was preparing the body. She was preparing the spirit to go. So sometimes in our work as well too, as hospice and palliative care clinicians, is it's putting also our values on the side. And that didn't mean I didn't educate this wife about what my concerns were. We still have to educate so people can make the best decision for themselves. But this isn't about what I thought this gentleman's good death should be. It's about how can I support what his values are and what his family's values are. It can
Right.
be a tough spot to be in, for sure.
Well, and don't you think that it heightens anxiety that someone might have about death if they don't think that their decision maker or their family or their caregivers or their healthcare team is going to support the kind of death that they want? That makes me very anxious when I have thought about my advanced directives and my advanced care planning and talked with my kids. I'm like, oh, these people do not work in healthcare. I'm going to be on a ventilator for a year. I don't think I want them to make my decision. That makes me anxious, thinking that my wishes would not be respected for what I consider a good death for myself.
Yeah, and then I can't help but still put on this hat of the privilege that we own, being white people in this country. And you think, I mean, when I think about the death anxiety as well too, of communities or folks in communities of color, or the LGBTQIA, or really other marginalized groups, and we wonder why they're so fearful. We wonder why we see the utilization of hospice so low.
Yes.
Right? It is because some of this is like, and it is a very valid mistrust that these folks have with the healthcare system. But it's like, when I can't even feel safe, let alone the worry of my values, who I've been throughout this whole life, my whole life isn't going to be honored in this last chapter.
Right.
So I think that's a really real fear that we have to take ownership for as healthcare clinicians. I can easily say, I'm 38. I wasn't a part. No, 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 no. We have to take ownership and responsibility if we are going to work within the healthcare systems, of recognizing the very, very real fear that marginalized communities have around death and dying and getting the support that they need.
Absolutely. So for my listeners who don't know, the statistics show that the enrollment of people of color in Medicare hospice services is significantly lower than the enrollment of people who are white.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's not a reflection necessarily on end-of-life care specifically, but over healthcare, a reflection on healthcare and the mistrust that people of color have. It's legitimate, honestly, we know that. But my goodness, that doesn't do anything to alleviate your anxiety about death and how the end of your life would be handled.
I mean, I've sat with some folks where, when we were talking about the decision to enroll in hospice and the symptoms they've had, and they speak that we can help with this pain. I have been told a good handful or two of times something along the lines of, are you actually going to treat the pain? Because last time I got accused of drug seeking behavior. Last time I got accused, or I reported pain and my pain wasn't addressed. So again, now their fear is not just that I'm going to have pain, but that you won't take my pain seriously. So, I mean, as we're getting into this a bit, but as we look at the death anxiety and our fear of death, is also very, very layered as well.
It is. Absolutely. Very nuanced. And I think very individual to the particular person, the individual.
For sure.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Okay, so we've spent a long time talking about all the anxiety around death. And it's making me a little anxious that we
Okay.
are not providing any sort of antidote or guidance. What would we say to caregivers who are concerned about how their person's going to die, or to the person with the serious illness? What would we say to them to help alleviate? And not the trite crap like it's all part of the process. Trust us, we're going to take care of you, things like that. What could we say that would legitimately help to ease the anxiety that they have around death?
I mean, I'm going to say this again. I think it goes back to understanding what they're scared of. Right? Because if somebody, again, maybe I'm taking care of you, Helen, and you've been a hospice nurse and you believe in what hospice provides, and you believe that you're going to have a very pain-free death, that they're going to be able to manage your symptoms that come up. You have that confidence. Me reassuring you of how the medical specialty of what hospice is for you, you're going to be like, I know that. I'm good.
Right. But I already trust it at that
Yeah.
point.
So I mean, I really think that this is the starting point for us as clinicians, is slowing down and creating space for it. This is something, I will say annoys the heck out of me sometimes about my profession, is there will be times where I will be reviewing notes or talking with someone and I'm like, yo, you're a social worker in hospice. You're not a volunteer, right? Like you need to be brave and ask some of these really hard questions, because if you're not doing it, who the hell is? Right? We live in this death avoidance society where, let's be real, I mean, there's even studies that suggest that caregivers' death anxiety can be higher than the patient that they're caring for. Right? So it's like families are trying to navigate this the best they can on a topic that isn't openly talked about. And this is our place. I'm so passionate about this being a social worker. This is 1000% in our scope of practice to be sitting down with, whether it be the patient themselves, the caregiver, both separately, together, whatever makes sense within that system, and talk about this very normal experience. And once they say fear, I will mirror that language, but I usually don't bring it up as fear. I bring it up as, again, concerns, worries, what keeps you up at night, whatever that may be. But I have to start there. Because then especially if this is someone I'm serving, if the worry is, I'm concerned that I'm going to have these symptoms. I have brought in my nurse before and we've sat down together and I'm like, do not skimp on this. I want you to say the medication. I want you to say how often we do it. I want you to talk about non-pharmacologicals. Like for some people, them just hearing that, dang, there's a really good concrete plan here.
Yes. There's more
Right?
than one med. More than one med.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like this can be really helpful. We talked about the existential piece, pulling in that chaplain to hold space, but again, then the chaplains have to ask the hard questions, which I feel like chaplains are usually pretty solid at, right?
Yeah, that seems like that's their business.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But diving in and talking with that, but with us, from my lens as a social worker, this is 1000% within our scope. What we need to be doing is opening up the door. And trust me, there's been times where I've asked someone, like, what are you most concerned about right now? And they shut me down so quick, Helen, they shut me down. But guess what I did? I invited you in. I opened the door. I showed you that this is something that we can talk about. And so maybe at that visit, they're not either in the headspace or not thinking about this. But then maybe 2 visits later, they're like, Rosie asked me about concerns, worries, or fears. She brought this up to me. This is something I'm thinking about now. Right? And don't also, from a clinician perspective, don't just ask once at the initial meeting, right? Continue to check in. I ask every visit before I walk out the door. At some point, I ask, what are you most concerned about right now? Because I want to know what we're addressing. This comes down to like the hospice plan of care, man. Like we have to know what we're supporting. And the only way we can do that is by asking intentional questions and also giving them permission if I'm pushing too much, if I'm going too hard, if we're not ready to talk about this yet, that's totally okay. But what I find time and time again is people do want to talk about it. They maybe just don't feel comfortable talking about it with their daughter or somebody where they're concerned about their grief experience. They don't have to be worried about me grieving. Right? I am this professional that's by their side, that cares about them, that wants to hold space for this. And sometimes that even involves me telling, I got this. I can handle this. We can talk about this together. right? So, I mean, it sounds almost too simple, but really, conversation is where it has to start. And it has to start with us not being anxious to have the conversation, right? Because mirroring is totally a thing. So, if you're saying, like, what are you anxious about? And you're anxious about asking what they're anxious about, like, they're going to feed into that as well, too. So, maybe even taking it a step back is we have to start doing our own reflection. Helen, you have death anxiety. I have death anxiety. Totally have death anxiety. Every single one of us does. And so but we have to own and recognize what our fears are. So also we are not we're not pushing our own stuff on other people as well too, to say it really simply, right? We're recognizing what's ours, what's theirs. But I think that's really where it needs to start is like, what are our fears around death and what do we need to do in order to show up more fully for those that we support?
I would add that I think those fears change
Yeah.
as the disease progresses, the decline happens, bodies change, minds change, and because of the mind body spirit link, they are thinking these things and new worries come up, different worries come up. Absolutely. Yeah. And the hospice plan of care is a living document, a living plan.
Yeah.
It changes as the patient changes. It's individualized and it flows. So, okay. I love this conversation. Feel like we could keep going, but so we've got to close. So here's I wanted to do something personal to close it out.
Okay.
What fears do you have about your own death? And I'm going to answer this for myself too. I'm going to let you ask me. But what fears would you share with me that you have about your own death, Rosie?
Oh shit. Do you want me to get real here? Do you want me to get real for a second?
Yes, please.
Because I saw this question and I was sitting on this of how vulnerable I want to be. But I think if I'm asking other people to be vulnerable, because that's what it takes to look at what we're scared of, right? We're so adverse to hard feelings that we think they're negative or they're bad and they're not, right? So when I think about my own death anxiety, how it comes out for me, because, right, what we fear something and then we have an anxious response. So what comes out for me sometimes is ruminating thoughts surrounding death of those that I love. When I was a teenager, one of my best friends, I was 14 years old. She died driving to school one morning. A year and a half later, it happened again. And then in my teenage years, I had a few people that were very, very, very close to me. Thank all the gods, all the things that I can possibly think had failed suicide attempts. So in my teenage years, I had a lot of exposure to death and almost deaths. And so what that started to do in my head is I would catch myself sometimes driving in the car. For some reason, it's always in the car. I don't know why. It's so unsafe, and I would just be thinking like, what would I do if my dad died? All of these were phone calls, right? We all get notified over the phone. So I imagine that I got this phone call that my dad died. Who would I call? What would I do? What would I do at the funeral? Like my brain, my type A brain starts going in this way of wanting to come up with a plan because I never wanted to be so blindsided again when somebody I love died.
Right.
We wonder why I became a hospice social worker. It actually has nothing to do with experience with hospice. It has to do with so much time around death. Now you fast forward and I love my career. I love my work. I'm so passionate about my work. And there are still times, right now, the role that I'm in is sometimes I work with really young patients. I see a lot of spouses and a lot of spousal grief. And it doesn't happen often, but every once in a while I will catch myself driving home and it will be in my head, the love of my life. I married the love of my life. And it will come up of, I got a phone call that Andrew died in a car accident. This is my trauma, right? Our grief, our death anxiety is formed by our experiences with death and dying. And I go into my head and I go through this, like, what would I do? What is my plan? Who would I call? How would I survive? Right? And this is something I have openly talked with my therapist about. We have created a cognitive behavioral therapy, or we engaged in cognitive behavioral therapy, came up with a plan. And sometimes that's what you need to do, right? Because I had to be safe while I was driving. And also this is going to come up sometimes when we are faced with death every single day. You know, I'm a human. I'm not a robot. I'm not AI, right? And so the losses that we bear witness to, they impact us. And so sometimes for me, that's where my death anxiety comes into play, is I am terrified about losing my husband. I have done so much planning surrounding my own death that I know my loved ones will be set to go, at least from that standpoint. That eases my anxiety, is knowing if I were to die, those things would be set. But I'm also like, I love life. I love life. And I got some stuff I really, 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 really want to accomplish before I die. And that just takes time. So that is another fear I have, is if something were to happen, whether it be a sudden accident or, right now I've just been caring for so many young folks with glioblastomas, it makes you imagine, what if I were to get that diagnosis, and my heart would be broken because I did not get to do some of the things that I've yet wanted to do. And I'm sure as I get older, some of those fears are going to change. Or as I get new conditions, some of those fears are going to change. But this is me being so vulnerable with your listeners, if they're thinking like something's wrong with me for having death anxiety. This is something I study, I teach on, I do death work all the time, and I still carry this because we're human. Right? Because we're human. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with me. This doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with you. If there's listeners out there thinking like, man, I've done this too. I have these thoughts too. I avoid hospitals too because it makes me nervous. I'm overly cautious because some of this might be my death anxiety. I have images this is part of being human. And I also just want you to hear, please get some support for yourself as well too. Right? Clinical social worker, have a lot of wonderful support surrounding me, and I still go to my therapist to process this and talk about some of this with. So whether you're somebody like me who is not facing death and is navigating their own death anxiety, like, talk with people, pull people in your corner, get somebody objective who can provide some support for you. And if you are somebody who is a hospice patient themselves, or your loved one is that hospice patient, lean into your team. Tell them these are things that you want to have conversations about. We will join you. We will be there. We will have your back.
That's perfect. Thank you for going so deep with that. I love it that you understand that being vulnerable, asking that of other people, doesn't have as much meaning if you're not willing to do it yourself.
Yeah.
Okay, so I will share mine as well. So I have a couple of things that I struggle with. I have a daughter who's a firefighter.
Mm-hmm.
And so I worry that I will get a cell phone call from her chief that there's been an accident, that she's been injured, burned, and been killed. And I think any parent of a child who's a first responder or works in an area of great risk deals with that. I think we all worry over our little chicks, right? Over our kids. But the other thing I have, after doing nursing for 36 years, and being a hospice nurse for 16, my worry is that I'm going to die in a hospital, cared for by just the regular ICU nurses, and the whole depth and meaning of being cared for by a hospice and palliative care team will not happen for me. I know that seems crazy to say. I'm worried that I'm going to die without any hospice care. But because this is what I've done with my career for the last 16 years, I want all that stuff that I said everybody should have. Yeah. I want all of those aspects. I want the best hospice care. I want to be able to have a chaplain and a social worker that will have these in-depth conversations with me. I want that layer of protection and support that hospice offers. And I'm scared that when it's my turn to die, that won't be there for me. Or my death will be very sudden, or I'll end up being on a ventilator. And that's what my death would be like. In my head, I'm outside in a hospital bed under the stars, or in, my favorite place, things like that. So that's what I worry about, that nobody's going to have the opportunity to do the deep dive. So I'm going to need you to be my clinical social worker, Rosie.
Girl, you just throw me on that healthcare directive. I'll hop on a plane and I'll be there for you. I got your back.
We're going to have a couple of conversations about my kids. The jokers as I call them. So This was a fantastic conversation. Rosie, where can people find you in the work that you're doing?
So you can go to my website. It's www.abetterending.org. Primarily how I'm serving through my company right now is through educations. So whether that be going into hospice organizations and addressing more of the psychosocial educational needs there, to doing keynotes at large conferences, speaking about the fears and regrets that we can have around death and dying and how we can live more fully now. So if you're looking for a speaker at your next event, I would absolutely love to connect with you.
And you're also working with the Minnesota Network of Hospice and Palliative Care, aren't you?
I am. I'm on their board of directors. So we're doing some wonderful work here, in the state of Minnesota to do everything we can to continue to not only support the hospice and palliative care organizations in Minnesota, but also expand access to our communities as well.
Perfect. Thank you for all the work that you do to support not just patients and families and caregivers, but to educate your colleagues and to really just support end-of-life care in general. I'm so grateful for all the wisdom that you share with us.
Thank you, Helen. I could say the same exact thing about you. This podcast is so needed. And your podcast actually is addressing death anxiety.
That's so true. I hadn't thought about it that way. Great finish.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Helen. I love being here with you.
Thanks for listening to the Heart of Hospice podcast. Check out our sponsor in the show notes and please leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. We would appreciate it if you would share this episode with your friends and family and anyone who needs to know more about hospice. Connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, no matter who you are or where you are in your hospice journey, you are the heart of hospice.
This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time.